Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I am pleased to rise today to speak on the perspectives and concerns of my constituents, as well as in my role as the Shadow Minister for Transportation regarding C-97, which is another omnibus bill proposed by this Liberal government. I want to begin by commending my honourable colleague, the member for Carlton, for his thoughtful and comprehensive response to the budget. As he so aptly noted, this budget is a string of broken promises and perhaps the most expensive cover-up in history. The Prime Minister and his government are attempting to change the channel on the SNC-Lavalin affair and are using billions of taxpayer dollars to make this happen. As we all know, the Liberal Party ran on the promise of balancing the budget in 2019. Well, Madam Speaker, promise made, promise broken, to the tune of $19.8 billion. For years now, the member for Carlton has repeatedly asked a simple question of the Finance Minister: when will the budget be balanced? And every time, the Finance Minister has refused to answer. Despite the Minister's refusal, we do know that there is no plan to balance the budget before 2040, if even then. By 2040, the Liberals' current plan would see $271 billion added to our debt. This government has left us with nothing in our back pocket. They've spent their paycheck, our paycheck, and our children's paycheck. And if we face another economic downturn, they'll spend our great-grandchildren's money as well, long before they've even been born. In just 3 years, this Prime Minister has added $60 billion to our national debt. And any comparison to the previous Conservative government spending is made in bad faith. While the Conservative government faced down the worst economic crisis since the 1930s, this Prime Minister has had nothing but clear sailing. Under the Conservatives, Canada weathered the economic storm better and returned to balanced budgets faster than any other country in the G7. That's because we spent when we needed to and saved when we could. Yet this Prime Minister has managed to turn a balanced budget and booming world economy into giant deficits and a slowing Canadian economy. While our neighbours to the south enjoyed a 3% growth in 2018, even further this year, Canada eked out a mere 1.8%. Only a few days ago, the Bank of Canada suggested that we will slow even further this year to 1.2%. Madam Speaker, I know it can be hard to track the numbers. In fact, that's what the Liberals count on. So let's simplify this. All the tens of billions of wasted, inefficient spending from this government has done nothing for our economy but bleed it dry. And what is this government's response? Spend more. They spend in the good times and the bad. They always spend. Madam Speaker, there is only one of two reasons for a country to have a deficit problem. It's either a revenue problem or a spending problem. With tax revenues actually higher than expected, the answer is clear. This government has a spending problem. In fact, with this budget containing over $41 billion in new spending over the next 5 years, a seemingly ridiculous question has to be asked. Are the Liberals intentionally spending so recklessly just to stay in deficit? How else can we explain a 20% increase in spending in the first 3 years of this government's mandate? All of this increased spending is taking place against the backdrop of higher taxes and an increased cost of living brought on by this government. Over 80% of middle-income Canadians are paying more in taxes now than they were 3 years ago. This has resulted in many Canadians finding it hard to make ends meet. Almost half of Canadians are within $200 of not being able to pay their bills at the end of the month. Any unforeseen expense would result in these families facing serious financial hardship. If this government had handled finances better, paid down debt, and built a rainy day fund, we could be cutting taxes for these families and helping them make their payments. Instead, this Liberal government has spent beyond their means and brought in a carbon tax, forcing families to pay more to heat their homes and drive to work. What's even worse, this Prime Minister is forcing those families to pay the GST on his carbon tax. Imagine a tax on a tax. Madam Speaker, there are two very specific sections which I would like to comment briefly on in my role as our Conservative Caucus Shadow Minister for Transport. First, I would like to discuss Division 12, this government's proposed changes to airport security screening. The Minister of Transport has once again been strong-armed by his colleagues to include drastic changes to the system in a Budget Implementation Act. It appears this minister and the government don't care about the economic well-being of our transportation system, and in this case, the air passenger system. At committee today, we heard that over the past 2 years, this Liberal government has, time and again, assaulted the Canadian airline industry with new taxes and costs without thought to how these changes will impact on air passengers. Not only that, this government is rushing legislative and regulatory changes through to meet an artificial deadline. The proposed changes in Division 12 contain another example of this. Rather than consult and facilitate negotiations between the parties on a new security screening entity and its assets, the Liberals are ramming drastic changes through Parliament and down the throats of the industry. Not only will this hurt airlines, but also passengers. For years, governments have collected more in the airport security fee that air passengers were charged than it paid out. This means that passengers have already paid for CAT's assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. In a ridiculous move, the government's changes will force Canadian travelers to pay for these assets all over again, without due consideration for their depreciation or their actual value. This will doubtless result in higher ticket prices before even accounting for the carbon tax. This out-of-touch Prime Minister doesn't get that most Canadians don't have a taxpayer-funded private jet at their disposal for weekend cross-country surfing trips. Most Canadians have to save in order to afford a vacation. Those average Canadians are the ones who will pay for the reckless, heavy-handed changes in this bill. From making Canadians pay a tax on a tax to forcing Canadian travelers to pay for screening equipment twice, this government is better than the Sheriff of Nottingham at squeezing taxes out of Canadians. Finally, Madam Speaker, I would like to discuss briefly Division 11, which contains changes to the Pilotage Act. While based on conversations I've had with stakeholders, I don't have deep concerns with the proposed changes. It is very disappointing that these proposed changes were once again buried in a Budget Implementation Act. Improvements to the Pilotage Act will reinforce Canada's commitment to a safe and efficient marine transportation system supported by a legal and legislative framework. Given that, an oil tanker moratorium in any region of the country is an insult to both marine pilots and shippers alike. An arbitrary shipping ban based on an ideological election promise is basically an admission that this government believes that there is no way marine pilots or shippers can do the job they have been trained to do. This is an insult to the entire industry. As I said earlier, Madam Speaker, this entire budget is a litany of broken promises, a broken promise to balance the budget, a broken promise to help the middle class, and a broken promise by introducing an omnibus bill. Come October, Canadians will remind this government what the cost of broken promises is.